I have been exploring a different way of growing a range of crops that are ready to harvest fairly quickly, ones that we generally want a fairly continuous supply of rather than a glut and then nothing. This quick rotation cropping is not so much a different way of growing, but a different way of fitting these crops into a growing space and developing an easier to follow schedule and planting plan. The basic method is to set aside a number of beds dedicated to these crops and to sow or transplant a range of different quick maturing crops to fill one of these beds. A few weeks later, we plant another bed with a similar range of crops and keep going with a similar planting every few weeks until we run out of beds. By then, the first bed will hopefully be mostly harvested and cleared in time to be planted again. And the cycle continues through all the beds right through the year, and the types of crops and the timing between the plantings changing as appropriate for the season. The 4 outside beds between the polytunnels have been set aside for this continual succession of quick rotation crop planting for the full year. We planted the first bed in mid-February, which was quite early even for Ireland, and the beds needed to be covered. Some of the slower growing crops were sown 4 weeks earlier in trays and transplanted into the bed at the same time as other fast-growing leaf and root crops were direct sown. On the same day that we planted the first bed, we sowed a tray of some slower growing crops so that they would be ready to transplant into the second bed about 3 weeks later. This repeated with about 10 crops being planted into the third and the fourth bed, 3 weeks apart each, and we are just in the process of planting the first bed again with the fifth batch of these crops. Of course, not all these crops were finished at the same time. Some of them were harvested and cleared well before we were scheduled to replant the first bed, and some of the slower growing crops are going to need another week or more to get a decent crop. This is where the simple schedule breaks down. It would be easier if we had 5 or 6 beds included in this rotation, or had extended the time between each of the plantings so that all of the crops would be done and cleared in time for the full bed to be planted all at once. But this would leave parts of the bed empty for quite a while, so we have been adopting a staggered approach instead, filling empty sections of the beds when they become available, either direct sowing or transplanting crops with appropriate days to maturity. And it will be interesting to see how this more complicated staggered approach works as the season progresses, and as we learn how to use this quick rotation crop method to help us grow a more continual supply of a lot of crops in a relatively small space.